The One Piece meta is in a very good place right now. The top decks in each color all have a fairly equal chance of performing well at competitive events. But some decks are a little more equal than others, and this is the place to find out what strategy is most equal. This tier list is based on both tournament results and my personal opinions on how decks perform to account for potential issues with regards to popularity, pricing, and skill ceiling. Getting right into it, we have King and Promo Uta as the two worst leaders in the game, being thrown right into E tier. King is a leader that does literally nothing, and Uta is a strategy revolving around characters that do literally nothing. I feel a bit bad putting King this low, but he is just that much worse than Kaido. He has the same consistency problems, with a much weaker payoff. It's also significantly lower than every other ruler. Red Zoro, for example, is the anti-king, and his skill can get value from turn 2 to 3 onwards. Uta is in a problem spot because the character only works with normal monsters. Zoro is just Uta, but better in every way. Zoro hits multiple units, and the unit Zoro boost actually do something useful, like have rush or be unblockable. Moving in the D tier, we have two more suboptimal leaders, albeit these two are much better than the previous two. Blue-Purple Kaido is a very weird deck. On paper it has a lot going for it, but in play it runs into some problems. First, an opponent can just play around the leader skill fairly easily. The cost of doing this does hurt some decks more than others, but overall it's not that impactful. Second, this deck gets absolutely destroyed by red and its variants. Third, this deck loses to the pure purple Kaido matchup. Overall, you end up in a situation where this deck loses to a very large portion of top decks, only to get mid-value with its gimmick in other matchups. Blue Crocodile is a weird less value option of Dolphy. Basically, you trade consistent access to value for some different control options and the ability to yeet a blocker and push game later on. The deck isn't terrible, but it does have an increased ability to brick as it tends to not run the top deck stacking cards. This deck can win events, however it takes a very skilled player to do it. C tier is a mixed bag. Here we have a collection of viable strategies that just didn't get enough support from the first set to have them be the best. These decks are very good, but just aren't optimized enough to consistently take tournaments. Blue-Purple Croc is a lot of people's second favorite deck. Being able to get value on both players' turn from so many orders is unique and genuinely fun. The downside is, the deck just has a weaker mid-game than everyone else. It can't bring Purple's big boys into the mid-game, like Kaido, and it doesn't get Dolphy's board spam either, so the deck just gets to draw cards to try to live, into either Big Croc for more order spam, or Mihawk for good removal. The color combination is cool, it just really doesn't do enough to play through the meta. It also feels like one of the few multicolored decks that could really benefit from being 5 life. Kozuki Oden is bizarre. On one hand, he's by far the fastest leader in the game, with his insane extra Dawn ability, and he has some really solid support. The downside is, this leader burns through your hand incredibly quickly, and the 2 at a time Dawn restanding ends up being kind of awkward to use consistently. You have to ask yourself a simple question. How many times would an aggro Kozuki Oden play just end up being worse than a restand from Eustass? Red Green Luffy is a mixed bag. On one hand, it has access to the 2 best colors, giving the deck insane consistency, and access to most of the big playmakers in the game. On the other hand, the deck is weirdly less optimal than Law. Luffy's skill costing 4 Dawn is a big ask. Committing half your resources to a single skill is a lot, especially since there's already a 5-drop in the game that does what Luffy does, and gives a body. All of this forces the leader to be more of a backup option as opposed to a go-to play, like in Red Zoro or Green Eustass. Not only this, but the red and green strategies this deck runs don't really work in combination together. Well, I should say they don't work as fluidly as you'd want. Green Supernovas want to play a tempo game, but they lose out on their ability to rest units as those are from Land of Wano. Red really wants to rush, but it doesn't really vibe with what green as a color wants to do. All this makes the deck very weird to play. Not bad, just weird and not optimized. B tier is where we start to get into our really good decks this format. Red Monkey D. Luffy is a slightly suboptimal build of Zoro. Now don't attack me for this just yet. Let's look at it. Luffy lets us play several cards faster than its Zoro counterpart. The deck gets to use cards like Rusher Sanji a turn earlier than if the card was played in Zoro. A similar thing occurs with anti-blocker Monkey D. Luffy. This means Luffy is even more of a rush deck than what we'd see in Zoro. This is a mixed bag. Either you see all the pieces you need and win without the opponent being able to do much about it, or you don't get the ball rolling soon enough and your opponent stabilizes the game state or counter rushes you. Blue Doflamingo is all about setting up in advance and getting a ton of free value. There are 2 things limiting how good Dolphy is. First, you have a limited number of deck stackers. If you don't see one of them early, it's gonna hurt. Second, the deck has a limited number of top-end removal options. You can only run 4 Mihawks and 4 7-drop Dolphys for matchups that care about it. But even if you can, you don't want to do that or you'll brick more often early on. This brings us to a larger point about what's good in the game. Decks that can do well with just about any hand, or have a built-in strategy on their leader, tend to be better than those that don't. Back to the positives for Dolphy. He has one of the better limited recursion options in the game right now, meaning he can reuse guard value or push through an opponent's removal. Dolphy's leader ability lets the deck play units and attack something at the same time, meaning Dolphy can outvalue an opponent if they're not careful. This deck also has blockers that get insane value. Boa gets draws, Kuma gets a free unit, and 3-drop Dolphy gets to stack the deck. Now we get into the big meta contenders. A tier is all the best options in this format, because spoilers, the format is balanced enough not to justify a deck in S tier. Starting off A tier, we have Purple Kaido. I described this deck as being able to bring the late game mechanic to you, and that's definitely true. The deck compensates easily for its heavy Dawn minus mechanic, with being able to ramp out with its field spell. Kaido has the best removal cards in the game. Units such as the 9-drop are able to remove a unit and then rush. Once the deck is able to get into the big drop contest, it's usually won the game. However, there are a few things keeping this deck down. First, the order that ramps the deck, Onigashima, only has an 80% chance to wind up in your hand by the turn you want to play it. This means in 1 out of every 5 games, the deck will end up extremely far behind on resources, and it will likely lose. Another consistency issue lies in being able to see the correct big drop when you need it. Even with the filtering in the deck, you might not always be able to see, let's say, the 7-drop over the 9 or 10-drop. So overall, while Kaido is a very powerful deck, it ends up missing out during events with a lot of rounds due to its variance. Red-Green Trafalgar Law is a really cool gimmick that can run away with games if it sees enough gas or the opponent doesn't know how to play around it. If the deck ever hits 5 characters on the field, the deck is able to play way more cards per turn than every other deck can, being able to reuse any number of on-enter effects, or just leave the board in the most optimized state possible. The only real issue with this plan is being able to get into that state in the first place. Decks like Green and Blue will use their tools to limit the number of units you have on field, making it a much harder win con to get to. Personally, I think that Red-Green Law is the best deck that uses red in set 1. Unfortunately, I can't justify putting it higher, as tournament results do not back up my belief. Red Zoro is the best aggro deck. It has the best rushers and can abuse otherwise bad cards by giving them enough power to hit. For example, Uda, which is an okay card, becomes able to strike the opponent's leader for free. Or another example would be Sunny-kun, who becomes a base 4k 1-drop. If the deck high rolls and sees its pieces, it can be almost impossible to stop. 5-drop Monkey D. Luffy can't be blocked, meaning if you're ever at no life against this deck, the game is over. The deck can also eat through powerful blockers, such as 8-drop Eustass, with cards like Otama by making them very difficult to justify saving. In Japan, I believe Red Zoro was considered to be the best deck, but I think English results have ended up shaking out a bit differently. So that leaves me with putting Green Eat Ass Caption Kid as narrowly the best deck in the game. It has the ability to do everything. It has fantastic control options with Okiku, Basil Hawkins, and 8-cost Caption Kid, so it can play tempo very well and grind out matchups like Red. Thanks to its leader's restanding skill, the deck can rush down decks like Kaido with an extra attack. Thanks to its 2 1-drop searchers and Raizo, the deck is also extremely consistent. Eustass just has everything it needs. As such, I'm putting it as the highest ranked deck on my tier list. So let's look at some local tournament results compiled from OnePieceTopDecks.com to see where my tier list compares to actual results. That's a bit different, but let's explain it. It makes sense that Kaido would do better at a local level, where there are less rounds and therefore less of a chance it'll brick and lose. Dolphy being this high is weird. It being local results could explain this. I mean, a lot of locals are less competitive, but maybe it's just people experimenting with the deck and finding out new strategies and pushing it further. The red shafting by these results is kind of weird as well. I think it's from either 1 or 2 reasons. It could be a budgetary reason, as red is the most expensive deck to play this format. Needing both the expensive starter deck and 4 copies of Red Zoro for whatever you plan on playing makes it kinda oof. Second, I think all the red players end up split deciding on what leader to play. All in all, it's a very balanced meta. I'm very impressed with how Bandai has handled the balancing of set 1. Not exactly as impressed with the distribution and secondary market side of the game, but what can you do? Except call out Bandai. I like this meta a lot, and I'm excited to see the game's development in the set 2 and 3. Thanks for watching, I'll see you next time.